Before sunrise, the ancient cathedral was already full. Crimson banners hung from every pillar. Thousands of nobles had traveled across the kingdom for this one morning. Musicians tuned their instruments beneath torchlight, and outside the great doors, King Draven Morcant stood alone, moments away from the wedding that was supposed to give his people a queen. He did not smile. He was not thinking about crowns, or vows, or the roses lining the aisle behind him. He was thinking about 300 years of ruling alone, feared by humans, respected by vampires, loved by almost no one who wasn't required to love him. He hoped quietly that this marriage would finally change that. Then a small hand closed around the edge of his cloak. He looked down. 5-year-old Aurelia stood there, staring up at him with an expression far too serious for a child her age. She glanced once over her shoulder, checking who was close enough to hear. Then she whispered the sentence that would end everything before it began. "She hurts my mommy every time you leave." Draven did not move. Behind Aurelia, her mother Celine had gone white. She was shaking her head, silently, desperately. Not because Aurelia was lying, but because she knew exactly what would happen if anyone believed her. Across the courtyard, Lady Vespera Duskbane smiled warmly at the arriving guests. Graceful, radiant. Every inch, the queen the kingdom believed it was getting. No one else had heard the whisper. No one else knew that in the next few minutes, the wedding everyone had waited years for would never happen. Draven had ruled long enough to know one thing above all others. Children rarely invent lies this specific, this detailed, this afraid. He knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. "What do you mean, little one?" But before Aurelia could answer, the cathedral bells began to ring. The ceremony was about to begin. To understand what Aurelia meant, you have to go back to who these people actually were. Because none of this makes sense, unless you know exactly what Draven was risking, and exactly what Vespera had spent years hiding. Draven Morcant had ruled his kingdom for 3 centuries. He was feared because he was a vampire, and vampires do not die easily and do not forgive easily, and do not forgive easily. But he was also respected, in a way few immortal rulers ever earned, because he governed like a man who remembered every servant's name. He thanked the stable boys personally. He asked the cooks about their families. He believed without exception that a crown existed to protect the smallest person in the room, not the other way around. The palace staff adored him for it. Celine Quinn was one of them, a widow, and a quiet one. Her husband had died years earlier, protecting villagers during a vampire raid he had no obligation to run toward. Draven had paid for the funeral himself, and Celine had never forgotten it. Since then, she had run the palace's daily upkeep with a kind of tireless, uncomplaining precision, checking every flower arrangement, folding every linen twice, comforting every nervous new servant before they even knew they needed comforting. She never asked for recognition. She raised Aurelia entirely on her own. And Aurelia, 5 years old, curious, endlessly observant, followed her mother everywhere, asking the kind of questions only a child asks. About bats, about crowns, about why some people smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. She did not understand lying. She had never learned how, which was, in the end, exactly why she was dangerous. Lady Vespera Duskbane had arrived at the palace 2 years earlier, and within weeks, everyone had fallen in love with her. She thanked the florists by name. She greeted visiting nobles with practiced warmth. She smiled in a way that made people feel, briefly, like the most important person in the room. Commander Ronan Blackthorn and Captain Cassian Thornvale, Draven's closest men, both fiercely loyal, had no reason to doubt her. They believed, sincerely, that their king had finally found something like peace after 300 years alone. No one suspected anything, except, sometimes, in small moments no one else noticed, Vespera's smile would falter the instant Draven's back was turned. Just for a second. Then it would return, so quickly that anyone watching assumed they'd imagined it. The morning before the wedding, Draven had stepped away briefly to inspect the cathedral preparations. The moment his footsteps disappeared down the corridor, Vespera's expression changed completely. She found Celine near the flower arrangements and asked, in a voice nothing like the one the nobles had heard, whether the roses looked acceptable. When Celine answered carefully, Vespera stepped closer and gripped her wrist, hard enough to bruise, and told her, quietly, that she should learn not to hide behind excuses. Celine apologized. She had done nothing wrong. Aurelia, sitting nearby with a picture book, saw all of it. Footsteps echoed from the corridor. Vespera released Celine's wrist instantly, smoothed her gown, and by the time Draven reappeared, she was smiling again. Warm, radiant, untouched. Draven noticed nothing. But Aurelia kept staring at Vespera, trying to understand something no adult had bothered to explain to her. How someone could smile one moment and turn cold the next, without ever changing their face. It had happened before. More than once. Every time Draven left a room, something in Vespera shifted, and every time he returned, it vanished again. So seamlessly that even the people who worked beside her every day began to doubt what they'd seen. Aurelia never doubted what she'd seen. She simply hadn't known, until this morning, that she was allowed to say it out loud. Now kneeling before her with the cathedral bells ringing behind him and the wedding about to begin, Draven asked again, "Aurelia, tell me exactly what you mean." And for the first time in years, someone in that palace was about to tell him the truth. The bells kept ringing, but Draven did not move. "Tell me exactly what you mean," he said again, quieter this time, as if the softness of his voice might make the truth easier to say. Aurelia glanced toward her mother once, the way children do when they need permission to keep going. Celine said nothing. She couldn't. Her hands were pressed against her apron, twisting the fabric without realizing it. So Aurelia looked back at the king and said it plainly, the way she said everything. "Every time you leave, she changes." Draven kept his eyes on her. "Changes how?" "Her face goes different. She's not nice anymore." Aurelia's small hand tightened on his sleeve. "She hurts Mommy. She grabs her arm like this." She demonstrated, gripping her own wrist. "And she says mean things. She yells at the gardeners too, and the maids. Everybody's scared of her, but nobody says anything because they're scared." "Aurelia," Celine's voice cracked as she stepped forward, finally finding words. "My king, please forgive her. She's only a child. She doesn't understand." "I understand what I saw," Aurelia said, and for a 5-year-old, there was something unshakable in the way she said it. "She's confused." Celine knelt beside her daughter, gripping her shoulders, her eyes darting toward Vespera across the courtyard and then quickly away. Children imagine things. Dreams, stories. She mixes them up sometimes. She doesn't mean, Celine. Draven's voice wasn't sharp. It was worse than sharp. It was patient. "I did not ask if she was confused. I asked what she saw." Celine fell silent. And in that silence, Draven understood something that troubled him more than the accusation itself. Celine wasn't defending her daughter's honesty. She was terrified of what would happen if people believed her. Commander Ronan Blackthorn had stepped closer during the exchange, close enough to hear everything, and something in his expression had shifted from confusion to a kind of slow, uneasy recollection. "My king." He kept his voice low. 3 servants requested transfers to the outer provinces this past month. I approved them without asking why. I assumed they simply preferred quieter postings. He hadn't thought about it again until now. Captain Cassian Thornvale joined them a moment later, having caught only the last part of the conversation, but enough of it to feel the same unease settling over him. "The gardeners," Cassian said slowly. "Twice now I've seen them go quiet the moment Lady Vespera walks past alone. I thought nothing of it. Servants are often quiet around nobility." Ronan looked at him. "Were they quiet around you?" Cassian didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind them, the wedding guests had begun to notice the delay. Murmurs rippled through the cathedral doors, nobles whispering to each other, human delegates exchanging glances, the orchestra faltering slightly as the ceremony failed to begin on schedule. A wedding that does not start on time invites questions no one had prepared to answer. Draven made a decision. He turned to the herald waiting near the cathedral steps. "Announce a delay. 30 minutes. No explanation." The herald hesitated. "My king, the guests." 30 minutes, Draven repeated, and the herald bowed and hurried away. The murmurs grew louder almost immediately. Nobles who had traveled days for this wedding did not receive unexplained delays. Well, and within minutes, quiet rumors had already begun weaving through the crowd, that the bride had changed her mind, that an omen had been discovered, that something in the king's chambers had gone wrong overnight. None of them came close to the truth. and Draven did nothing to correct any of it. Vespera arrived at his side before the herald had even finished speaking. She looked radiant, still glowing in her wedding gown, but her eyes had already found Aurelia, and for the briefest moment, something cold passed behind her expression before it dissolved into visible distress. "Draven, what's happening? Why are we delaying?" Her voice trembled, and then, as if the realization had only just struck her, her eyes filled with tears. "Is this about what that child said?" She didn't wait for an answer. "I've tried so hard to be kind to everyone here," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I've welcomed every servant, every noble, every guest as if they were my own family. And now, on my wedding day, I'm being accused by a 5-year-old who—" She stopped herself, as if catching some cruelty before it left her mouth, who has clearly been told things she doesn't understand. She turned toward Celine, her voice softening into something almost pitying. "I know it isn't your fault if she repeats things she's overheard. Servants talk. Children listen. I don't blame you for that. It wasn't an accusation. Not directly, but everyone standing close enough to hear understood exactly what she meant." And Celine's face drained of what little color remained in it. Draven watched all of it without a word. He watched Vespera's tears, perfectly timed. He watched Celine's fear, which looked nothing like guilt. He watched Aurelia, who hadn't flinched once, hadn't changed her story, hadn't looked away from either woman even as the accusations flew over her head. A king who ruled only by instinct would have chosen already. But Draven had ruled long enough to know that instinct without evidence was simply another kind of blindness. He would not condemn a woman on a child's word alone, and he would not dismiss a child simply because the accused wore a crown. "Well, enough," he said, and something in his tone silenced everyone at once. Vespera's tears, the noble's whispers, even the wind seemed to still. "I have made no judgment. I will make none until I understand what has happened in this palace. Truth fears no investigation." He looked once more at Aurelia, then at Celine, then longer, at Vespera. "The wedding will resume when I say it resume. When I say it resume." He turned and walked toward the cathedral doors, leaving the murmuring crowd behind him. Only Ronan and Cassian followed close enough to hear what he said next, his voice low enough that no noble, no servant, and no bride would ever know the words had been spoken at all. "Find out everything," Draven said, quietly. "Before the ceremony resumes, I want the truth, not rumors." Ronan Blackthorn began in the kitchens, because kitchens were where palace secrets always surfaced first. The elderly cook, a woman named Marta, who had served 3 generations of the royal household, kept her eyes on her pots when he approached. He asked simple questions. How had preparations gone this week? Had anything unusual happened? Marta answered carefully, giving him nothing, the way servants learn to give nobility, nothing when nobility starts asking questions. It took nearly an hour before she finally set down her ladle and looked at him directly. "You want the truth, Commander, or do you want me to keep my position?" "Both, if you will allow it." Marta studied him for a long moment, then glanced toward the door, making certain it was closed. "Lady Vespera has a temper," she said quietly. "Not the kind anyone sees at dinner, the kind that comes out when the king isn't in the room. She's called me useless, called the younger girls stupid, clumsy, worthless, over spilled flour, over nothing at all. I've worked in this kitchen 40 years. No noble has ever spoken to me the way she does. Why has no one said anything?" Marta's laugh had no humor in it. "Say something, and go where? This palace is the only home half these servants have. Lose your position here, you lose everything with it." Ronan moved through the palace after that, one servant at a time, and slowly the same pattern repeated itself. A young laundress, no older than 17, hesitated so long before speaking that Ronan nearly gave up until she rolled back her sleeve and showed him a bruise along her forearm, yellowing at the edges, days old. "She said I folded the linens wrong," the girl whispered. "I didn't argue with her. I never argue with her. A stable boy, barely 12, wouldn't meet Ronan's eyes at all." When Ronan pressed gently, the boy admitted only that he'd heard screaming from the east corridor one night, weeks ago, and had been too afraid to investigate. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't wanted to know more than he already did. By the time Cassian joined Ronan in the empty guard room that afternoon, both men sat in a silence that had nothing to do with fatigue. "They all tell the same story," Cassian said finally. "Different words, same shape. She's warm when the king is near. Something else entirely when he isn't, and every one of them terrified to say so. Fear doesn't lie the way people do," Cassian said. "Liars invent details to make themselves sound more convincing. These servants weren't trying to convince us of anything. They wanted us to stop asking." Ronan rubbed a hand over his face. "Aurelia's story hasn't changed once. Not a single detail. Celine's fear isn't guilt. I've seen guilt, and it doesn't look like that. Then what does Celine's fear look like?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he thought of something he hadn't considered in years. A memory buried under a decade of routine palace business. "You remember Aldrich Quinn?" Cassian's expression shifted. "The soldier who died during the raid on Hollow Creek. Celine's husband." Ronan leaned back. "I was there. Rogue vampires broke through the eastern tree line before dawn, faster than anyone expected. Aldrich wasn't even meant to be on that patrol. He traded shifts with a friend who had a sick child at home. When the attack came, he didn't run. He held the village gate alone long enough for every family inside to escape through the back fields. He didn't survive it. No." Ronan's voice had gone quiet. "The king rode out himself when word reached the palace. Too late to save Aldrich, but he carried the man's body back personally, paid for the funeral out of his own treasury, and visited Celine every week for the first month afterward, simply to make certain she and her daughter had enough to live on." Cassian was silent for a moment. "She's owed him her loyalty ever since. She's owed him her life," Ronan said. "A woman like that doesn't invent lies against a future queen. She has too much to lose and nothing to gain. If anything, she's spent this entire investigation trying to protect Vespera, begging Aurelia to stay quiet, insisting her daughter misunderstood. That isn't the behavior of someone chasing revenge. It's the behavior of someone who's more afraid of Vespera than she is loyal to the truth, which tells us everything about how dangerous Vespera actually is." Neither man said anything for a while after that. Outside, the delayed wedding guests had grown restless, their murmurs drifting faintly through the palace corridors, but neither Ronan nor Cassian moved to return to the courtyard. Whatever they said next needed to happen where no one could overhear it, which was precisely the problem. Because Vespera had noticed the delay wasn't the only thing that had changed. She had noticed the way certain servants avoided her eyes more carefully than usual, the way conversation stopped the moment she entered a room. The way Ronan Blackthorn, a man who had never once questioned her in 2 years, had spent the entire afternoon moving quietly from room to room, speaking to people who had no reason to speak with the commander of the guard on an ordinary day. She was not a fool. She had survived on instinct long before she ever wore a crown's promise, and instinct told her clearly that something in the palace had shifted beneath her feet. So she began watching, not openly. She was far too careful for that. She smiled at the nobles who approached her with concerned questions about the delay, reassured them the ceremony would resume shortly, laughed softly at a joke about wedding day nerves. But beneath the performance, her eyes tracked every servant who passed too quickly, every guard who wouldn't meet her gaze, every whisper that died the moment she came near. It was how she found herself near the guardroom's half-open door, as evening light slanted low through the corridor windows. She heard Ronan's voice first, low and controlled. "If the stories match this closely, we can't dismiss them as coincidence. We need to see it happen ourselves, not just hear about it after the fact." Then Cassian's voice, quieter still. "The king will want proof before he acts. Something undeniable." Vespera stood perfectly still in the shadowed corridor, her hand resting against the cold stone wall, and for the first time since arriving at this palace 2 years ago, felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Fear, not for Celine, not for the servants, for herself. Vespera did not move from the corridor until she was certain her breathing had steadied. Then she smoothed her gown, straightened the crown that had not yet been made official, and walked away with the same graceful poise she wore for every noble in the palace, except now, every step carried a purpose. The nobles would never see. She found the laundress first, alone in the linen room, folding sheets with careful, practiced hands. "You spoke with the commander today." The girl's hands stilled. "My lady, I only answered his questions." "I'm sure you did." Vespera's voice was soft, almost kind, the way it always sounded when guests were near. But her eyes carried nothing warm in them at all. Let me be clear about something so there's no confusion later. If I become queen of this kingdom, and I will remember exactly who spoke against me during these last few hours, and exile is a mercy I extend only to people who have earned it. The girl said nothing. Her hands trembled around the folded sheet. You have a mother in the outer village, don't you? Vespera continued, tilting her head slightly. It would be such a shame if her position there became complicated. Say nothing further to the commander. Do you understand me? The laundress nodded quickly, and Vespera left before the girl's tears could fall. She moved through the palace this way for the better part of an hour, cornering a gardener near the eastern hedges, warning a stable boy in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, reminding each of them, in careful, controlled sentences, exactly what they stood to lose. She promised nothing directly. She never needed to. A woman who would soon hold a crown did not have to threaten outright. She only had to remind people what crowns were capable of. By the time she reached Selene, the sun had begun sinking low over the western towers, and the wedding guests inside the cathedral had grown loud with impatience. She found Selene alone near the flower stores, checking arrangements that no longer mattered, her hands busy with work that gave her somewhere to look besides Vespera's face. You should have taught your daughter better, Vespera said quietly, closing the door behind her. Selene's spine went rigid. My lady, please, do you know what happens to servants who embarrass a future queen on her wedding day? Vespera stepped closer, her voice never rising above a whisper, which somehow made it worse. I have been patient with you, Selene, more patient than you deserve, but patience has a limit, and today you tested mine in front of the king himself. She only said what she saw, Selene whispered, and immediately regretted it. Something in Vespera's expression sharpened. Careful. That sentence sounds very much like an accusation. I meant nothing by it. If your daughter continues speaking, Vespera said, each word measured and precise, I will make certain she has very little left to speak about. No home. No mother nearby to protect her. Children who cause this much trouble sometimes find themselves sent very far away to places where no one asks questions about where they came from. Selene's face went white. Please. She's 5 years old. She doesn't understand. Then teach her to understand, Vespera said. Before I decide to teach her myself. She left without another word, smoothing her gown once more, already rehearsing the smile she would wear the moment anyone else came near. Draven had spent the afternoon doing something he rarely allowed himself to do, doubting people he had trusted without question. Cassian found him in the map room, alone, studying nothing in particular. My king, tell me what you found. Cassian hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Every servant we spoke with told nearly the same story, almost word for word. At first, I thought it strengthened the case. Consistent accounts, consistent details. But now you think differently. Now I think it's too consistent, Cassian admitted. Real witnesses remember things differently from each other. Different details, different order. Small contradictions that come naturally when people describe the same event from separate angles. These accounts line up too perfectly, as if something happened after we spoke with them, as if they were reminded, very recently, of exactly what not to say. Draven's jaw tightened. Someone's been to them already. That would be my guess, my king. Who else knew we were investigating? Only the three of us. And Selene, briefly. Though she said nothing to anyone, she's been too frightened to leave her daughter's side since this morning. Draven considered this in silence. Outside, faint and distant, he could hear the murmur of impatient nobles still waiting inside the cathedral, a wedding suspended in a moment that refused to resolve itself. Then someone else discovered we were asking questions, Draven said finally, and moved quickly enough to silence the answers before we could hear them honestly. There's something else, Cassian said. Several servants avoided my eyes today who never have before, not out of respect, out of fear. The stable boy in particular. This morning, he told me clearly what he'd heard. This afternoon, when I asked him to repeat it for the record, his story had changed. Smaller, vaguer, as if someone had convinced him it was safer to remember less. Draven closed his eyes briefly. I will not build a case on testimony that can be frightened into silence. Then what do we do, my king? We have no proof beyond words, and the words themselves are already beginning to change. Draven turned from the window, and something had settled in his expression. Not doubt anymore, but resolve. "We stop asking people what they've seen," he said, "and we go see it ourselves." Cassian frowned. "My king? If Lady Vespera suspects an investigation, she will hide anything worth finding. Not if she believes there is nowhere left for anyone to hide." Draven moved to the far wall of the map room, where an old, unremarkable tapestry hung between two stone columns, one that had belonged to the palace since before Draven's own coronation, older than the memory of any servant currently employed within these walls. He pulled it aside. Behind it, cut into the ancient stone, was a narrow passage, dark and forgotten, leading somewhere Cassian had never known existed. "Every king who has ruled this palace has known of these corridors," Draven said quietly. "Built centuries ago, when trust was a luxury no ruler could afford completely, they run beneath nearly every hall in this palace, including the one outside my chambers, where I am expected to depart tomorrow morning before the ceremony resumes." Cassian stared into the darkness of the passage, understanding forming slowly across his face. "You mean to let her believe you've left? I mean to see, with my own eyes, exactly what happens the moment she believes I have." The plan required Draven to do something he had never once done in 300 years of ruling. Leave his own palace for a reason that wasn't real. By morning, word had spread that the king intended to ride briefly beyond the palace walls before the ceremony resumed, to clear his thoughts, the herald explained, and to return within the hour ready to complete what had been delayed. It was a reasonable enough explanation. No one questioned it. No one questioned it. Nobles murmured their understanding. Servants nodded and returned to their duties, and Vespera, watching from the palace steps in her wedding gown, offered nothing but a soft, patient smile. Trumpets sounded as the royal carriage rolled through the front gates drawn by 4 black horses, the king visible briefly through the carriage window before the doors of the palace closed behind him and the courtyard settled into its usual rhythm. Vespera watched the carriage disappear down the long stone road until it vanished completely past the tree line. Only then did her shoulders relax. She turned from the window with the particular ease of someone who believed entirely that she was no longer being watched. Draven, meanwhile, had never boarded the carriage at all. The moment the doors had closed behind him, he'd slipped through a servant's passage Cassian had cleared minutes earlier, moving swiftly and silently down through the narrow stone corridor hidden behind the map room tapestry, a passage that ran, as he told Cassian, beneath nearly every hall in the palace built centuries earlier by kings who had learned, sometimes at great cost, that trust alone was never enough to govern safely. He emerged in a hollow alcove behind the eastern hall, concealed behind an old stone relief nobody had looked at closely in decades, close enough to see and hear everything that happened in the corridor beyond without being seen himself. He did not have to wait long. Celine appeared first, carrying a stack of folded linens toward the guest chambers, her steps quick and quiet, the way she always moved, trying to occupy as little space in the world as possible. Aurelia trailed behind her, humming softly to herself, her small hand looped through the strap of her mother's apron. Vespera rounded the corner moments later. The change was immediate. Her posture didn't just relax, it hardened. The softness she wore for guests fell away entirely, replaced by something colder, more precise, as if she had simply been waiting, patiently, for permission to stop performing. "You're behind schedule," Vespera said, and her voice carried none of the warmth she'd offered the nobles minutes earlier. "My apologies, my lady. I don't want apologies." Vespera closed the distance between them in 3 sharp steps. "I want competence." Is that truly too much to expect from someone who has done this work for years? She reached out and gripped Celine's wrist, hard, the same grip Aurelia had described days earlier, and Draven watched from the shadows as Celine's face tightened against the pain without a single sound escaping her. "Your husband would be ashamed," Vespera said quietly, almost conversationally, as if the cruelty cost her nothing at all. Dying a hero in some worthless village skirmish and leaving his widow behind to fold linens badly. What a legacy. Draven's hand curled into a fist against the cold stone wall. Celine said nothing. She had learned, clearly, that silence was the only response that didn't make things worse. Vesper released her wrist and turned toward Aurelia, who had gone very still. Her humming stopped entirely, her small body pressed close against her mother's skirts. "And you..." Vespera's voice dropped lower, gentler in tone, but sharper in every other way. "You've been telling stories again, haven't you? To the king, to his men." Aurelia didn't answer. Little girls who tell stories about their betters sometimes find themselves very far away from their mothers, Vespera continued, crouching slightly so her eyes were level with Aurelia's, the same posture Draven himself had used, twisted into something unrecognizable. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one asks questions. "Would you like that?" Aurelia's lower lip trembled, but she still said nothing. "I thought not." Vespera straightened, smoothing her skirts as though the conversation had cost her no effort whatsoever, and turned toward a passing servant carrying a tray of silver. "That's not how those are meant to be arranged. Do it again. Properly, this time, unless you'd like to explain to the guests why the reception looks amateurish." The servant lowered his eyes and hurried away without a word. Draven watched all of it. Every gesture, every threat delivered in a voice too calm for what it actually promised. Every flinch from servants who had learned, evidently over many months, that silence was the only safety available to them. He had expected, walking into this corridor, to feel anger. He had prepared himself for it. The particular fury of a king discovering betrayal within his own walls. What he felt instead was something far quieter and far worse: heartbreak. Because the woman standing in that corridor was not simply hiding cruelty behind a mask of grace. She had built an entire person over 2 years specifically for him to fall in love with. Every kind word, every charitable gesture, every warm laugh at exactly the right moment, all of it constructed with the precision of someone who understood precisely what he needed to see in order to trust her completely. None of it had ever been real. He had planned to marry a woman who did not exist. Before he could gather himself fully, a voice rang out from the far end of the corridor. A young page, breathless, clearly relaying news he believed urgent and welcome. "The king returns! The king's carriage approaches the gates!" The transformation happened instantly. Vespera's posture softened. Her expression melted into something warm and open, the coldness vanishing so completely that if Draven hadn't witnessed the last several minutes with his own eyes, he would never have believed it capable of existing in the same person. She smoothed Celine's sleeve, gently, almost affectionately murmured something about hoping the wedding could resume soon, and turned toward Aurelia with a smile so tender it nearly convinced even Draven standing, hidden not 30 feet away, that he had imagined everything. "Run along now, sweet girl," Vespera said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Aurelia's forehead with a gentleness that made Draven's stomach turn. "I do hope we can all be friends soon." Celine murmured a quiet thank you for nothing at all, gathering Aurelia close, and hurried away down the corridor without looking back. Vesper remained a moment longer, straightening her gown, preparing her face for an audience that did not yet know what she truly was. Draven stepped out from the shadows. The stone relief that had concealed him scraped softly against the floor, and Vespera turned toward the sound, already composing her expression into warmth. Then she saw him, and for the first time in 2 years her smile did not return at all. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Vespera's mouth opened, then closed. Draven watched something calculating pass behind her eyes. The same swift recalibration he'd seen her perform a dozen times in the last few minutes, except now there was nothing left for her to transform into. He had already seen the truth underneath. "Draven," her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. "I can't explain." "You don't need to," he said quietly. "I saw everything I needed to see." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing alone in the corridor for the first time since she'd arrived at this palace without a mask, fitted perfectly to her face. The cathedral had filled completely by the time Draven returned to it, nobles and human delegates packed into every pew, patience worn thin after a full day of delay. The murmurs rose the moment he appeared at the far end of the aisle, not from a side door, not from his chambers, but walking alone down the center of the cathedral itself, still in the same clothes he'd worn that morning, no bride beside him. He climbed the steps to the altar and turned to face the crowd. Silence spread through the cathedral, like something physical. "There will be no wedding today," Draven said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. The murmurs that followed were immediate and loud: confusion, disbelief, a rising tide of questions no one dared ask aloud, until Vespera herself appeared at the cathedral doors, still in her gown. her face already streaked with tears that had clearly been summoned the moment she'd realized what was coming. "My king, please." Her voice broke beautifully, tragically, exactly as it always had. "I don't understand what's happening. I have done nothing but love you faithfully for 2 years, and now you would humiliate me in front of the entire kingdom?" Draven said nothing. He let her walk closer, let her performance play out fully, because he understood now that the crowd needed to see this unfold before they would believe what came next. "Someone has poisoned your mind against me," Vespera continued, turning to address the nobles directly, her tears somehow perfectly composed even in their falling. "A servant, jealous of what I've been given. A child too young to understand the difference between imagination and truth. I have shown nothing but kindness to everyone in this palace, and this is how I am repaid?" "Celine raised no accusation against you," Draven said calmly. "Her daughter spoke first. Celine begged me repeatedly to ignore what Aurelia said, because the woman is clever enough to know how guilt looks," Vespera said quickly. "She has coached that child to say whatever serves her." "I watched you myself," Draven said. The cathedral went utterly still. "This morning, while you believed I had ridden beyond the palace walls, I remained within it. I saw you grip Celine's wrist hard enough to bruise. I heard you mock her husband, a man who died defending this kingdom's own villagers. I heard you threaten a 5-year-old child with exile if she continued telling the truth. I watched you humiliate a servant over silver settings, and I watched your entire manner transform the instant someone announced my return, as though the woman standing beside me for 2 years had simply been a costume you wore whenever it served you." Vespera's tears did not stop, but something behind them shifted, calculation giving way, finally, to genuine fear. "That isn't— Draven, you misunderstood what you saw." "I did not misunderstand a bruised wrist." Commander Ronan stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the cathedral doors. "My king, if it serves the court, I have spoken personally with a dozen servants over these last 2 days. Every account matches what you witnessed, in detail, though several changed their stories after being quietly threatened. I can name which ones, and when." Cassian followed him forward. "I can confirm the same. A laundress showed me a bruise days old. A stable boy heard screaming weeks ago and was too frightened to report it. These were not stories invented in a single afternoon." A ripple moved through the gathered crowd. Servants who had come to witness the wedding from the back of the hall, standing quietly among themselves, glancing at one another with something that looked, for the first time, like permission. An elderly cook stepped forward first, then a young laundress, then, hesitantly, a gardener who had said nothing to anyone in weeks. One by one, servants who had spent months swallowing fear now found themselves standing in front of the entire kingdom, adding their voices to testimony that could no longer be threatened into silence. And then Celine stepped forward too, Aurelia's hand held tightly in hers, her voice trembling but no longer hiding. "My king." She looked up at Draven, and something in her expression had finally broken free of the fear she'd carried for months. "I begged you not to listen to my daughter, because I was terrified of what would happen to us if you didn't believe her, and terrified of what would happen if you did. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage sooner. You had more courage than anyone else in this palace," Draven said quietly. "You simply had more to lose." Vespera's composure finally shattered completely. "This is absurd. Servants lying to protect each other, a widow inventing stories to elevate her own position, a child too young to know what she's even seen." Her voice rose, sharp now, the warmth gone entirely from it. "You would believe them over me?" "I would believe my own eyes," Draven said, "over a woman who wore kindness like a costume for 2 years and removed it the moment she believed no one important was watching." He turned to address the full cathedral, his voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of rule. "Effective immediately. Lady Vespera Dustbane is stripped of her title, her estates, and all influence within this kingdom. She is permanently banished from these grounds and forbidden from ever returning to this palace." The guards moved forward without needing to be told twice. "You cannot do this." Vespera's voice climbed into something raw and furious as they took hold of her arms. "I have done nothing wrong. Draven, please, I love you." "You loved what marrying me would give you," Draven said, and something in his tone closed the conversation entirely. That was never love. It was patience. She was still screaming her innocence as the guards escorted her down the long cathedral aisle past nobles who watched in stunned silence, past servants who watched with quiet, exhausted relief, past Celine and Aurelia standing close together near the altar until the great doors closed behind her and the sound of her voice finally completely disappeared. The cathedral remained silent for a long time after that. Nobles filed out slowly, murmuring amongst themselves, uncertain how to process a wedding that had ended before it began. Servants lingered longer, exchanging glances that carried something unfamiliar after months of fear. A kind of cautious, disbelieving relief. Draven stood alone at the altar long after the last of them had gone, watching the empty cathedral settle into quiet. He'd expected, once the truth came out, to feel something like victory. Instead, watching Celine guide her daughter gently out through the side doors, he understood that unmasking Vespera had been the easier task. The throne had never truly been his burden, earning back the trust of everyone he had failed to protect. That would take far longer than a single afternoon. The weeks that followed felt strange to everyone in the palace, in the way silence feels strange after a long, familiar noise finally stops. There was no wedding to prepare for, no nobles arriving daily with gifts and expectations, no sharp voice waiting behind closed doors for the king to leave a room. The palace simply existed, quietly, and for the first time in longer than most servants could remember, quietly meant something good. Draven spent those first weeks doing what he always did after difficult decisions. Working. He met with Ronan about restructuring palace patrols, with Cassian about the servants who had come forward and what protection they deserved going forward. He signed a decree, quietly at first, ensuring no servant could be dismissed or punished for reporting mistreatment without a formal investigation. It was a small thing. It felt to him like the least he owed them. It was Celine he noticed slowly, almost without meaning to. She had returned to her usual duties within days, moving through the palace with the same quiet efficiency she always had, checking linens, organizing the kitchens, comforting the younger servants who still flinched at raised voices out of habit. She never spoke of what had happened. She never asked for anything in return for what she'd endured. She simply continued the work she had always done, as though surviving months of quiet cruelty entitled her to nothing more than the chance to keep serving. Draven found himself watching her a little longer than necessary. More than once, he noticed the way she gave half her own bread to a young kitchen girl who'd gone without breakfast, without making it look like charity. He noticed her mending a torn sleeve for an elderly groundskeeper who could no longer see well enough to thread a needle himself, staying an extra hour after her own duties simply because the man had mentioned it in passing. He noticed that she never once saw recognition for any of it. That kindness, for Celine, seemed to be something closer to instinct than performance. It was, he realized slowly, the exact opposite of everything Vespera had shown him for 2 years. Aurelia noticed him noticing. She had, in the weeks since the wedding that never happened, developed an entirely fearless relationship with the king of the realm. Something Draven found both baffling and, increasingly, one of the better parts of his day. Do bats really turn into vampires? She asked him one afternoon, trailing him through the palace corridors with the persistence only a 5-year-old could sustain. Because Marta says vampires can turn into bats, but that doesn't make sense, because bats are already bats. Were you ever a bat? I have never once been a bat, Draven said gravely. But could you be one? If you wanted. I am afraid that particular skill belongs to storybooks, not to kings. Aurelia considered this with visible disappointment. That's a shame. Bats can fly. Crowns can't do anything. Crowns are quite heavy, actually. Is that why you never smile when you wear it? Draven had no immediate answer to that one. She asked him, over the following days, whether vampires lived forever, whether it hurt to be immortal, whether he missed his own parents, whether kings were allowed to have best friends, or whether that was against the rules. Her questions had no strategy behind them, no diplomacy, no careful phrasing designed to spare his feelings. She simply asked whatever occurred to her the same way she had told him the truth on his own wedding day, and Draven found himself answering more honestly than he answered most nobles who'd known him for decades. One evening, he found her sitting alone in the palace library, frowning at a children's book far too advanced for her, sounding out words slowly and getting most of them wrong. "Would you like help?" he asked. She looked up, surprised. then shrugged in the exaggerated way children do when they're pretending not to care about something they care about very much. "Mommy's busy. She said I could try by myself." Draven sat down across from her, folding his considerable height into a chair meant for someone half his size, and spent the next hour helping a 5-year-old sound out words about a rabbit who was afraid of thunderstorms. It became, without either of them planning it, a habit. Most evenings, once her mother's work was finished, Aurelia would find him somewhere in the palace and drag him quite literally on more than one occasion, toward whatever book she'd chosen that day. Celine found them like that one evening. Aurelia curled against Draven's side, sounding out a difficult word with his patient guidance, and something in her expression shifted when she saw it. Not fear this time, but something softer. Something Draven hadn't seen from her before. She didn't say anything. She simply watched for a moment, then quietly continued past them toward the kitchens, and Draven noticed, for the first time, that she hadn't flinched at the sight of him the way she once might have. The guard she'd kept up for months, out of necessity, out of exhaustion, out of fear that had been entirely justified, it was lowering, slowly, without either of them acknowledging it directly. The palace, in those weeks, began to feel like something Draven hadn't experienced in centuries. It began to feel like a home. He found himself lingering in the royal gardens one evening after Aurelia had been put to bed, the sky settling into the deep violet that came just before true night, the crimson roses along the pathways closing slowly for the evening. He hadn't come out here with any particular purpose. He simply hadn't wanted to return yet to the quiet of his own chambers. Celine was there too, a little further down the path, gathering the last of the day's cut flowers into a basket, humming something soft and tuneless to herself, unaware yet that she wasn't alone. Draven watched her for a long moment, the low light catching gently along the edges of her dark hair, and found himself thinking of something he hadn't allowed himself to consider until that exact moment. For 2 years, he had searched for a woman who could make this palace feel like something worth ruling, someone whose warmth might finally answer 3 centuries of solitude. He had been looking in entirely the wrong direction, and standing quietly in his own garden, watching a woman who had never once asked him for anything, Draven found himself wondering for the first time whether the happiness he'd spent so long searching for had been standing quietly beside him the entire time. Folding linens, mending sleeves, raising a fearless little girl who told the truth, even when it cost her everything. He hadn't been looking for her. He simply hadn't been looking closely enough. The child's laughter drifted through the evening air, he wondered, for the first time without flinching from the thought, whether the thing he had spent 3 centuries searching for had never required conquest or alliance at all. Perhaps it had simply required someone who never demanded anything from him except honesty. He didn't act on the thought that night, but he didn't forget it either. In the months that followed, something between Draven and Celine shifted so gradually that neither of them could have named the exact moment it happened. It began with small things. Draven asking if she'd care to walk with him through the eastern gardens after her duties ended, not as a king issuing a summons, but as something closer to a request. Celine, still unused to being asked rather than instructed, said yes more out of habit than intention the first time. She kept saying yes after that. There was no pressure in it. Draven made certain of that, deliberately, aware of exactly how much power still sat unspoken between them even now. He never rushed her, never assumed, never let a single conversation carry the weight of expectation. They simply walked, most evenings, talking about nothing important. The kingdom's harvest, Aurelia's growing vocabulary, an old story from Celine's childhood in a village Draven had visited once, centuries before she was born. Celine's guard, raised so carefully over years of necessary caution, lowered by degrees so small, she barely noticed it happening herself. Aurelia noticed everything, the way she always did. "You walk with my mommy every day now," she informed Draven one afternoon, with the flat certainty of a child stating an obvious fact. "We enjoy the gardens." "That's not why," Aurelia said, entirely unbothered by the king's attempt at diplomacy, and went back to chasing a moth across the courtyard before he could formulate a response. It was late spring when the butterflies arrived in the royal gardens, dozens of them, drawn by the roses that had bloomed wild and thick along every path, filling the afternoon air with slow, drifting color. Aurelia ran ahead of them both, delighted, chasing after every pale wing that dipped low enough to reach, her laughter carrying easily across the open lawn. "Come look," she called back, reaching for them both without thinking. one small hand finding Celine's fingers and the other finding Draven's, pulling them forward until all three of them stood together beneath a low branch, thick with fluttering wings. "Look, look!" Aurelia laughed, breathless, spinning slightly between them. "Dad, look!" The word left her before she'd even considered it. The way true things sometimes escape children before caution catches up to them. She heard a heartbeat after she'd said it. Her hand tightened instinctively in Draven's, and she froze completely, her small face going pale with the particular horror only a child feels after saying something they weren't certain they were allowed to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered, covering her mouth with her free hand, eyes wide. "I didn't mean, I don't know why I said that. I'm sorry." Draven knelt. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with hers, the same posture he'd used weeks earlier outside the cathedral doors when the entire truth of this palace had first come undone, except now there was nothing to investigate, nothing to uncover. Only a small girl, trembling slightly, terrified she had said something wrong. He smiled. It was not the composed, measured smile he offered nobles or foreign delegates. It was something entirely unguarded, something that had waited a very long time to reach his face. "You don't need to apologize," he said quietly. Aurelia blinked up at him, uncertain. "I've been hoping," Draven said, his voice catching slightly on the words, "that you might call me that someday." For a moment, Aurelia simply stared at him as if checking whether he meant it. Then she threw both arms around his neck and he gathered her into the gentlest embrace he had ever offered anyone in 300 years of living, holding her the way he imagined distantly. A father was meant to hold a daughter, as though she were something far more valuable than any crown he had ever worn. Celine stood beside them, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears falling before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she managed, half laughing through the tears. "I don't know why I'm crying." "You know exactly why," Draven said gently, rising with Aurelia still held close against him, and reached for Celine's hand with his free one. She didn't pull away. For the first time since her husband's death, since the years of quiet endurance, since months of protecting her daughter's safety at the cost of her own voice, Celine allowed herself to simply stand there, surrounded by two people who loved her without demanding anything from her in return, and cry without trying to hide it. Draven watched them both, Aurelia's face pressed against his shoulder, Celine's hand still resting in his, and understood with a clarity that settled over him like something inevitable, finally arriving. He had spent 3 centuries believing a king's greatest treasure was his throne. He had spent 2 years believing it might be found in a marriage built for the good of his kingdom. He had been wrong both times. This. A child who trusted him enough to call him something she hadn't planned to say. A woman who had survived years of cruelty without once losing her gentleness. This was what he had actually been searching for, without ever knowing its name. That evening, after Aurelia had been tucked into bed and the palace had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Draven found Celine alone in the garden where the butterflies had gathered that afternoon, the roses now dark and fragrant beneath the rising moon. "Celine," she turned, and something in his expression made her set down whatever task she'd been quietly occupying her hands with. "I've spent 300 years believing a king's life belonged to his kingdom alone," he said carefully. "I no longer believe that's entirely true. Draven, I'm not asking you tonight to become a queen," he said gently. "I'm asking something far simpler and far more important to me. Would you consider sharing not only this palace with me, Celine?" He paused, searching for the right words, and found, in the end, only the honest ones. "But my life, all of it, however long that turns out to be." Celine didn't answer him that night with words at all, only with her hand tightening around his, and a smile breaking through her tears that told him everything he needed to know. But she made him wait a proper answer for exactly 1 week, teasing him gently about it every evening, until he finally admitted, laughing, that a king who had ruled 3 centuries without difficulty had somehow been thoroughly outmaneuvered by a housekeeper. Yes, she told him, the following evening in the same garden, beneath the same darkening roses. Yes, Draven, all of it, however long that turns out to be. 1 year later, the cathedral filled again. This time, no one arrived out of obligation, and no one waited with quiet dread for something to go wrong. The crimson banners still hung from every pillar, the same roses still lined the aisle, but everything else about the morning felt entirely different from the wedding that had never happened the year before. The servants did not stand at the back of the hall this time. Draven had insisted and Celine had agreed without hesitation that there would be no division of rank within these walls today. Cooks and laundresses and stable hands sat beside nobles and human delegates, and no one among the nobility dared object, not after everything the kingdom had learned about what happened when cruelty hid behind a crown's promise. Children ran between the pews, laughing unshushed. Villagers who had traveled from the outer provinces filled the standing space near the doors, drawn by a story that had somehow, over the past year, spread well beyond the palace walls. A king who had chosen truth over appearances, and a maid who had raised her daughter with more quiet courage than most nobles managed in a lifetime. Ronan and Cassian stood near the front, both dressed formally for the occasion, watching with expressions that carried none of the professional composure they usually wore in the king's presence. Cassian, in particular, seemed to be fighting a losing battle against visible emotion, which Ronan noted quietly and chose, for once, not to mention. Draven stood at the altar. And this time, when Celine walked toward him down the aisle, she was not hurrying past in service to someone else's wedding. She wore a gown the color of deep garden roses, simple compared to what the nobility expected of a future queen, and utterly unforgettable for exactly that reason. Aurelia walked just ahead of her, scattering flower petals with the deep seriousness of a 6-year-old given an important job, occasionally pausing to wave enthusiastically at servants she recognized in the crowd. The ceremony itself was brief. Draven had never needed elaborate words to mean what he said, and when he took Celine's hands at the altar and promised her a life built on honesty rather than convenience, the words carried a weight that needed no embellishment. "I once believed," he said, loud enough for the full cathedral to hear, "that I understood what this kingdom needed from its queen. I was wrong. I needed someone who serves not because rank demands it, but because kindness is simply who she is. I found her already living within these walls, and I very nearly failed to see her at all." Celine, for the second time in a year, cried at her own wedding, though this time entirely from joy. Afterward, before the celebration could begin in earnest, Draven turned to address the full cathedral once more, Aurelia standing beside him, her small hand held firmly in his. "Before we celebrate," he said, "there is one matter I intend to make permanent today." He knelt before Aurelia, the way he had in the garden months earlier, and the way he had outside these very cathedral doors a year before. "Aurelia Quinn," he said, "I would be honored